Good morning, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Our esteemed guests, Professor Charles Hirschkind and our Assistant Professor Hidayat Shefkale Tuksal, our distinguished scholars and students, welcome to Ibn Haldun University's third annual Sociology Day Symposium. Saygıdeğer misafirimiz Professor Charles Hirschkind ve Doktor Öğretmen Üyesi Hidayat Şefkatlı Tuksal ve birbirinden kıymetli hocalarımız ve çok değerli öğrencilerimiz, hepiniz İbn Haldun Üniversitesi Sosyoloji bölümünün düzenlediği 3. Sosyoloji Günleri etkinliğine hoş geldiniz. Allah'ın selamı ve bereketi üzeriniz olsun. In this profoundly volatile period, very volatile area of rapid geopolitical shifts, the foundation of our world is being deconstructed right before our very eyes. Palestine, Gaza alone, is not only a testament to the power of narrative building and the triumph of truth over structures of oppression, but it also demonstrates that no global order, no matter how long-lived, has ever been immutable. Bu son derece hızlı jeopolitik değişimlerin gerçekleştiği dalgalı dönemde dünyanın temelleri gözlerimizin önünde deşifre oluyor. Filistin yalnızca Gazze, sadece anlatı inşa etme gücünün ve gerçeğin baskı yapıların üzerindeki zaferinin bir kanıtı olmakla kalmıyor. Aynı zamanda ne kadar uzun süreli olursa olsun, hiçbir küresel düzenin değişmez olmadığını da gösteriyor. At the heart of our inquiry lies the understanding that ideas are not neutral vessels of information. They are potent instruments that wield the power to shift the ideological landscape, to ignite ire in the face of injustice, to mobilize agents of change. Sorgulamamızın merkezinde fikirlerin tarafsız bilgi araçları olmadığını anlaşıya yatmaktadır. Onlar ideolojik manzaranın değişmesine güç katıp adaletsizlik karşısında öfkenin alevlenmesini sağlayan ve değişim ajanlarını hareket geçen etkili araçlardır. Together in this research symposium, we endeavor to explore innovative strategies, harness the power of narratives to not only topple hegemonic and oppressive structures of our world, but to forge and foster alternative avenues and visionary solutions. Bu araştırma sempozyumunda bir araya gelerek anlatılan gücünü kullanma stratejilerini keşfetmeye amaçlıyoruz. Bu stratejiler sadece dünyamızın hegemonik ve baskıcı yapılarını yıkmakla kalmayıp aynı zamanda alternatif yollar ve vizyoner çözümler oluşturmaya ve teşvik etmeye hedefliyoruz. To begin, I invite our head of the Sociology Department, Professor Dr. Ramazan Aras, to the stage to give his speech. Sosyoloji bölümün başkanımız Profesör Dr. Ramazan Aras'ı karşılama konuşmalarını yapmak üzere sahneye davet ediyorum.
Thank you very much, Ilham. Ilham, she's one of our brilliant MA students in the program. Just to have a brief introduction to her, for her. Dear guests, dear students, and dear keynote speakers, welcome to our third Sociology Days and the Student Research Symposium. And we are very excited, we are very honored to have all the keynote speakers and the presenters and our dear moderators and all participants in this program. This is our third, I will say, annual Sociology Days. We want to make it a very nice tradition and create a platform for our graduate students when we started this initiative to create a platform in order to share their research and engage with each other and try to empower their intellectual ability and skills throughout presentation and sharing of their research. So last year, we had another intention that due to the highly demand from brilliant top high schools in Istanbul, that why don't you invite us? So last year we made a new decision that yes, why not? So since there is a demand from high schools, we should also include those who are really interested in social sciences, but in particular, they are interested in sociology and anthropology. So last year we started with 2 panels with 8 students from 6 different high schools, but this year there was a huge demand. More than 160 students applied from around 20 high schools, top high schools in Istanbul, and we appointed our MA and PhD students to supervise them. And as a result of this process, 38 of them, as far as I remember, are presenting throughout this sociology days that we are starting today, and we are going to end Sunday noon, inshallah. So with inclusion of high school students, very intelligent high school students and undergraduate and graduate students, we want to create this platform for students in social sciences in Turkey to empower the ground of the social sciences and to more popularize sociological and particularly also anthropological studies in Turkey in order to create this intellectual environment, not only for students from Turkey, but at the international level also, to engage, to allow them to create this space in order to engage with each other and to promote the further research in different venues in the fields of sociology and anthropology and the larger context in social sciences. So when we were discussing and talking with the academic board of the symposium, which is a completely student initiative, there were different ideas what to focus on. But of course, when October 7 event, the Tufan started, of course, it was very clear that what will be the theme of this year. So it is social conflicts, wars, peace, and justice in today's world. So as you also have experienced and have recognized, the world is going through a huge turmoil since October 7, and to me it is one of the breaking points in the world of in the history of the world, not only in the history of the region but in the history of the world. And nowadays we are witnessing the global resistance movement that has been shattering the silence of the hegemonic powers globally in different parts of the world. And as you have been also observing, there is a rise of a global solidarity through the conflict and post-conflict context in different parts of the world. But the occupation of the Gaza and the October 7 has kind of triggered and empowered that power of this global solidarity at the global network. And in order to build a process of justice for all, as we have observing today, the students' movements in North America, and now it is expanding to Europe and Turkey and other parts of the world. I think we are witnessing a huge global collaboration and solidarity, not only with Palestine, but for anyone who is being socially or culturally or politically oppressed in any parts of the world. So we hope that our sociology days will enhance that spirit and empower and make a modest contribution to this ongoing global solidarity and global movement of the youth, which is shattering the silence and which is trying to deconstruct and the narratives, the global narratives, and try to deconstruct the hegemonic discourses that are surrounding us in different ways. Thank you very much for our keynote speakers, Professor Charles Hirschkind and Assistant Professor Hidayet Şefkati Tuksal, for accepting our invitation. And I am very honored and pleased for all participants for their labor. I want to thank you for the organizing committee, for the academic board, and for the mentors who have been working with the high school students for 5 almost months, supervising them. I am very grateful for their labor and efforts. And I want to shortcut now, and we want to move on. Thank you very much again for being with us.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's a pleasure, it's a great pleasure to participate in these third sociology days. So it has become a tradition, actually. So I was tasked with presenting Charles Hirschkind. I think, your professors mentioned him so much that he's known to most of you. I would like to welcome him. So thank you for accepting our invitation. As you know, he's the chair of anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. Also, his research interests concern religious practice, media technologies, and emerging forms of political community in the urban Middle East and Europe. He gives particular attention to diverse configurations of the human sensorium and the histories, ethics, and politics they make possible. Taking contemporary developments within the traditions of Islam as his primary focus, he has explored how various religious practices and institutions have been revised and renewed both by modern norms of social and political life and by the styles of consumption and culture linked to global mass media practices. His book, The Ethical Soundscape, Cassette Sermons and Islamic Counterpublics, received the Sharon Stevens First Book Award from the American Ethnological Association. Probably you don't remember the cassette. You are too young, most of you, to remember it. But mind you, he also worked on YouTube and sermons on YouTube. That probably you can relate to. The book explores how a popular Islamic media form, the cassette sermon, has profoundly transformed the political geography of the Middle East over the last 3 decades. I can certify to that. I'm part of that generation. So he also is the co-editor with David Scott of Powers of the Secular Modern, Talal Asad, and his interlocutors. Other publications, and he has many publications. Probably I would try to mention mostly those who are related to our topic today. Some of them deconstructing the main narrative on Europe and the history of Europe, on especially the exclusive history of Europe, where he is mentioning the contribution of Islam, so the presence of the past in the European present, through many works on, for example, in Granadian Reflections, Material Religion, also in the afterlife of Moorish Spain, in Niloufer Goul as an editor, Islam and Public Controversy in Europe, and many others. Some of the most interesting for me personally, as a Tunisian who was so imbued with the Tahrir Square image, his discussion with Ala Abdel Fattah, Tahrir Square, that interview you made in 2012, and experiments in devotion online that I have already mentioned, but also you continued with the analysis of I think that's it on Tahrir Square. Did you write anything else on Egypt or the revolution? Sorry, I missed that. So Hirschkind has received numerous grants and fellowships from, among others, the Mellon Foundation, Social Science Research Council, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, American Council of Learned Societies, and the Carnegie Endowment. He's also a member of the advisory board of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Ibn Khaldun. And we are delighted to welcome him today as a keynote speaker of our third Sociology Days. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see you this morning. A big thanks to the Sociology Department here at Ibn Khaldun, particularly Ramadan Aras, for his kind invitation to come my first time to Istanbul, which I'm very excited about, and also the opportunity to hear you today and later on over the next couple of days. So I'm looking forward to that. Okay. Speaking to a group of Israeli high school students in 2022, Deputy Religious Services Minister Matan Kahana commented, "If there was a sort of button you could push that would make all the Arabs disappear, send them on an express train to Switzerland, I would press that button." It has long been obvious and has become more obvious since Israel's campaign of annihilation began last October, that most Israelis and many of their Western supporters wish, with Minister Kahana, that Palestinians, or what some refer to as the Palestinian problem, would simply disappear. While there may be disagreement concerning the appropriate means by which to bring this about, whether through murder and starvation, as in Gaza today, or through expulsion and forced resettlement, or via techniques of confinement and enclosure that render Palestinians invisible, or some combination of all of these, as has long been Israeli policy, the fantasy of Palestinian non-existence has hovered in the imagination of Israelis and their Western allies from well before the country's official foundation in 1948. Across each political conjecture, each peace talk, security measure, bombing campaign, the dream of a Palestinian free world has hung like a signpost, an unfulfilled promise, a deferred but ultimately desirable future. The dream of Palestinian disappearance, of course, was integral to the Zionist imaginary from early in its histories, evident in one of its core slogans, "A land without a people for a people without a land." Early Zionist plans on the mass transfer of the Palestinians out of the region often wavered between the political and military pragmatics of ethnic cleansing and fantasies of an effortless, miracle-like ejection, as in Herzl's 1898 reflection on, quote, spiriting the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country, he stated. Golda Meir's 1969 statement made during an interview with the deputy editor of the Sunday Times that, quote, there was no such thing as Palestinians, is yet one more manifestation and step toward enactment of the wish for Palestinian erasure. Let me return to Minister Kahana's statement about a button that would make all the Palestinians disappear. There is something striking about this formulation and the political imagination that informs it. Kahana's comment is frequently echoed today in interviews with ordinary Israeli citizens who, when asked about the possible futures for Israelis and Palestinian, what possible futures for Israeli, Palestinian, and Palestinians may follow at the conclusion of Israel's current military assault on Gaza, often wistfully confess their, quote, wish that they would all just go away. The lightness, the what-ifness of such a comment deserves attention. The wish gives expression not to a policy proposal or a military strategy, but to something in the genre of fantasy, a kind of poof, it's gone story, exemplified also in Kahana's button that whisks the Palestinians off to the magical land of Switzerland. How is it in the context of a horrific war and following many decades of entrenched struggle with immense consequences for Israel's now highly militarized and securitized society, that ordinary citizens, when asked about imaginable futures for the millions of Palestinians whose lives are deeply entrenched with their own, can answer this serious question with a poof, it's gone fantasy of mass disappearance? Not an actual policy proposal, but a magical button. Certainly, Israel's military superiority gives its citizens the luxury of such flights of fantasy, such detachments from reality. More than this, such comments, I want to suggest, point to the way Palestinians have been deprived of considerable reality in Israel and the West, and that in this state of diminished perceptibility have become a people whose existence can be imagined by ministers and ordinary people as entirely eliminable. Just kick them all out, as one Israeli interviewee recently suggests. Send them anywhere, another proposes. Carpet bomb, a third opines. This fantasy and the deprivation of the political and existential reality of Palestinian lives it both expresses and enacts is one of the enabling conditions of the current genocidal onslaught of Gaza taking place today. In what follows, I want to use this opportunity to reflect on some of the linguistic and discursive conditions through which this attenuation of Palestinian perceptibility has been produced, by which the human horror of annihilation can be envisioned without the slightest flicker of moral strain. This question is often approached through the lens of dehumanization, the process by which the humanity of Palestinians has been rendered illegible within the highly racialized discourses that dominate Israeli and Western imaginaries of Palestine. References to Palestinians, such as that by the current Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, as human animals, are exemplary of this dehumanizing rhetoric and are pervasive not only in Israel, but within much of European and US media. New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman's recent recourse to insect metaphors to describe Hamas and the Iranians is hardly exceptional. My talk here today builds on the analysis of dehumanizing practices, but focuses more specifically on the languages that dematerialize and disappear Palestinians, that render them perceptually distant, inaccessible, absent, and hence weaken and undermine whatever claims they make on moral and political conscience. In my conclusion, I want to turn to reflect on the contemporary significance of the Palestinian struggle for peoples of the global South. Since the 1960s, the plight of the Palestinian people has only appeared above the threshold of diplomatic and political visibility when Palestinians have put it there, almost always through acts of militant resistance and struggle. Thus, the actions of Palestinian resistance groups in the 1960s and 70s, the first and then second Intifada, more recently attacks launched from Gaza by the Hamas government and other factions, all of which were followed by massive retaliatory measures by Israel, in each case resulted in short-term diplomatic attention to the Palestinian question, followed thereafter by its subsequent abandonment and disappearance, once immediate political pressures declined. When the Palestinian question has been raised outside of these cycles of militancy, violence, and retaliation, it has largely been addressed as a refugee problem, a matter of humanitarian assistance rather than as a consequence of political subordination and ethnic cleansing. Palestinians were assimilated, in other words, to the category of unfortunate humanity, and hence banished from moral and political visibility. Silence on the issue has largely been the norm, a condition encouraged, supported, and manufactured by American and European governments continually over the decades in their frenzy to show support for Israel. In more recent years, Israel has established new methods for achieving a more profound disappearance of Palestinians from the global purview. In Gaza, this has been done through a blockade that kept the entrapped Palestinians in a permanent state of poverty, unemployment, hunger, and dependency, an architecture of enforced scarcity and suffering meant to crush the spirit and will of those seeking to resist the relentless bulldozer of Israeli expansion into Palestinian lands. In the West Bank, a similar, though somewhat more porous blockade, combined with intense restrictions on movement and daily harassment and violence at the hands of the Israeli military personnel and settlers, has aimed to achieve comparable results. Encircled and confined within a vast network of walls, checkpoints, physical, digital, and administrative barriers, subject to policies and practices meant to decimate the material infrastructures sustaining their will, hope, resistance, and agency, Palestinians, until October 7th, had been effectively taken off the map, effaced from the scene of political and economic calculation for all except a few humanitarian agencies entrusted to ensure that some form of their bare survival. This disappearance had widespread political consequences, allowing Israelis to not only enjoy the fruits of their impressive technology-driven economic growth, but also to make great strides towards normalizing their relations with their neighboring Arab countries. The Abraham Accords that were mediated by the Trump administration officials in 2020 and that enabled Israel to establish bilateral agreements with a number of Arab regimes were negotiated without any Palestinian participation and with very little mention of the Palestinian situation at all. The one-time primary obstacle to Israel's economic and political integration into the region, the besieged Palestinian population under its sovereign control, had all but disappeared from view behind Israel's carceral occupation, for both Israelis and for the Arab leaders eyeing the economic and security advantages that relations with Israel would procure their autocratic regimes. The near total withdrawal of European and American journalistic and political attention for the relentless decimation of Palestinian lives and the accelerating expropriation of their lands in recent years ensured the success of Israel's attempt to conceal the reality of their brutal occupation. Beyond the technologies of walls and barricades, however, Palestinians have also been deprived of considerable reality through languages which attenuate their historical, social, and political existence. What do I mean by this? One aspect of this phenomenon concerns the way Palestinians have been positioned historically as less a present-day society than one that inhabits the present anachronistically, as a contemporary remnant of a world whose dissolution has been foretold. A useful parallel can be made here to the languages used by European settler colonialists of the 18th and 19th centuries to describe the Native Americans, whose society they were in the process of destroying. Seen through the evolutionary lens of racial and racist sciences of the time, Native Americans were understood by the colonists to be remnants from an earlier stage in human development, inhabitants of the present, but not fully belonging to its time. In this world, but actually part of another. This historicist perspective on the lives of the Native Americans, they encouraged, strongly colored the perception of the European colonists, enabling them to imagine that the genocide they were engaged in had in some sense already taken place, already had the status of an evolutionary destiny. Native Americans could then be seen as an element of the contemporary world, but one without a future. Early Zionist descriptions of the indigenous peoples of Palestine deployed the same social evolutionary languages used by the settler colonists in the Americas, frequently identifying Palestinians as, quote, primitive, barbaric, and uncivilized. Such colonialist categorizations often played a role in Zionist arguments and depictions that sought to undermine claims to Palestinian or even Arab identity among the peoples of the region. For example, in his 1937 book, The Rape of Palestine, the American Zionist William Ziff suggested that due to their lack of racial pride, the Arabs no longer existed, having become nothing more than, quote, a motley assortment of peoples, low in the scale of human development, who speak the Arab tongue. The idea of the Palestinians as a people who had been surpassed by the March of Progress, remaining only as a kind of historical residue, an anthropological curiosity, repeats itself across Zionist literature of the time. When it was recognized that Palestine was not entirely devoid of people, the designation of those people as a historical detritus, moving inexorably toward dissolution, served to dematerialize their lives, confining them to a state of political liminality and invisibility. Ben-Gurion's rhetoric of civilizational decline is exemplary here, as when he writes, "The deserts of Israel were once inhabited in ancient times, and even today they are not entirely unpopulated." More recent writings by Israeli scholars shed some, though not all, of the evolutionary language that characterized the earlier Zionists, but often still ascribe some notion of historical backwardness to Palestinians, now cast in a more anthropological idiom, as in the case of the historian Benny Morris. He notes, "Commitment and readiness to pay the price for national self-fulfillment presumed a clear concept of the nation and of national belonging, which Palestine's Arabs, still caught up in the village-centered, or at best a regional political outlook, by and large completely lacked." End of quote. Mired in a pre-modern political identity, Palestinians, in Morris's formulation, cannot accede to the form of recognition required for modern political visibility, namely the nation. They inhabit the present, but, as interlopers from a vanished or vanishing past, it does not belong to them. Interestingly, Morris recognizes the parallel between the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians carried out by Israel and the genocide of Native Americans by European colonists, finding justification for both instances in the notion of historical necessity. There are circumstances in history, he writes, that justify ethnic cleansing. There was no choice but to expel that population. It was necessary to cleanse the hinterland and cleanse the border areas and cleanse the main roads. It was necessary to cleanse the villages from which our convoys and our settlements were fired on. Even the great American democracy could not have been created without the annihilation of the Indians. There are cases in which the overall final good justifies harsh and cruel acts that are committed in the course of history, he says. The word annihilation does not provoke the slightest moral hesitation from Morris, nor is there any question that it is Israel that is on the side of good, on the right side of history. When he turns to the description of Palestinian Muslims, Morris invokes well-worn stereotypes that extend from European colonialism to contemporary Islamophobia. I quote, he says, "A world in which human life doesn't have the same value as it does in the West, in which freedom, democracy, openness, and creativity are alien. A world that makes those who are not part of the camp of Islam fair game." As I noted, Morris's discourse on Palestinian backwardness and moral corruption draws on a familiar colonial imaginary. As with earlier Zionist writers, he links this colonial vision of the primitive, ruthless native to a theory of history emphasizing the necessity of violence for historical progress, for good's overcoming of evil. In this way, the ethnic cleansing carried out by the Israeli state in 1948 is removed from the realm of political events and placed on the existential plane of redemptive history, a plane which the Palestinians can only inhabit negatively, a shadow existence to be removed by history's forward motion. Within this historical frame, the perceptibility of Palestinian life is thinned out, attenuated, rendered inaudible against the background of rival Zionist claims that occupy the foreground of economic and political legibility. The sort of temporalizing discourse I have been describing, one that deprives the Palestinians of presence by figuring them as part of a disappearing past, has a long history, not only in the Orientalist imaginary of European colonialism, but also in the discipline of anthropology, a point brilliantly analyzed by the Dutch anthropologist Johannes Fabian in his classic text, Time and the Other. Anthropology's alignment with the project of colonial domination, according to Fabian, lay less in the disparaging attitudes of ethnographers toward the so-called primitive societies they studied than in their textual employment of a rhetorical device that denied the co-evilness of the anthropologist's time and the time of the societies represented in their writings. Now I do need a drink. 1 second, please. There's too many shishas in Cairo is the problem here. And I was looking forward to Turkish shishas, but now I've overdosed on Egyptian one, so. Okay. In his words, anthropology demonstrated a persistent and systematic tendency to place the referent of anthropology in a time other than the present of the producer of anthropological discourse. The other's empirical presence, Fabian asserts, turns into his theoretical absence, a conjuring trick which is worked with the help of an array of devices that have the common intent and function to keep the other outside the time of anthropology. This absenting of the other, described by Fabian, through the device of temporal distancing, what I have discussed above as one of the rhetorical means by which the deprivation of Palestinian reality is secured, aligns anthropological discourse with projects of power predicated on the displacement or elimination of indigenous communities, or in those aspects of community that hinder their effective subordination. From the earliest Zionist narratives in the 19th century through contemporary Israeli and Euro-American journalistic accounts, a temporalizing rhetoric has given to Palestinian life a vaporous, flickering quality, one that, as I'm arguing here, gives sustenance to Zionist and Western fantasies of Palestinian disappearance, and thus Zionist and Western practices of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Such a fantasy can be witnessed in the recent comments of Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law and one-time senior advisor, made during a recent interview at Harvard University. In his description of possible next steps for Gaza and its people, Palestinians are endowed with a remarkable lightness and malleability, an object offering little resistance to superior forces of capitalist development and Israeli power, a striking image given the many decades of Palestinian struggle, resistance, and violent suppression. Kushner starts off immediately by anchoring his perspective in the dominant logics of investment capital, a view which immediately relativizes and attenuates the realities of the conflict. Gaza's waterfront property, he notes, it could be very valuable if people would focus on the kind of building up livelihoods. You think about all the money that's gone into this tunnel network and into all the munitions. If that would have gone into education or innovation, what could have been done? It's a little bit of an unfortunate situation there. But I think from Israel's perspective, I would do my best to move the people out and then clean it up. That's Kushner. Viewed from the lofty heights of the profit-making potential of real estate investment, the destruction of Gaza and its people is scaled down to a little bit of an unfortunate situation, a situation easily remedied by a little bit of old team effort, doing their best, as Kushner calls it, to sweep out the people and clean up the mess, as Kushner may have had to do at his fraternity hall at Harvard after a night of drinking. And how is it that this ethnic cleansing is to be accomplished? Kushner states, I would just bulldoze something in the Negev and would try to move people in there. In other words, just do that, like pushing a button for a train to Switzerland. What the popular press often describes as the intractable problems of Israel-Palestine appear in Kushner's vision to be as light as a feather, just bulldoze something. The indefiniteness of the term signaling the simplicity of the solution. It is this distance from reality of Palestinian lives, of the brutality of ethnic cleansing, that invites unfathomable violence. A few moments later in the interview, Kushner starts to question whether Gaza exists at all, if the place and its residents are more fiction than reality. He says, I am not sure there is much left of Gaza at this point. If you think about even the construct, Gaza was not really a historical precedent. It was the result of war. You had tribes in different places, and then Gaza became a thing. Egypt used to run it, and then over time, different governments came in. Here, Kushner extends upon, although in his characteristically fumbling manner, the older Israeli discourse on the historical absence of a Palestinian identity. Gaza became a thing, he suggests, a passing fashion, but one that is ultimately empty and fictitious. Particularly telling is the way Kushner links the current destruction of Gaza, a place where there is, quote, not much left, to his claim that Gaza is a mere construct without historical foundations, as if the one, the decimation of Palestinian life by the Israeli military, was simply the natural outcome of Gaza's tenuous claim to historical legitimacy. The genocide of the Palestinians of Gaza just makes visible the fact that they were never really there, in Kushner's rendering, a mere construct assembled from the fragments of a historical formation whose time had long passed. In short, at the core of Kushner's style of reflection on the question of Palestine, including on the current war in Gaza, is an incredible lightness of Palestinian being, a perceptual shallowness that subverts even the possibility of registering the violence done to them. The Israeli and more broadly Western project of disappearing the Palestinian people has assumed horrific dimensions with the current onslaught in Gaza. Though the practices and aims we are witnessing are hardly new, only the scale and intensity of the destruction. As Samra Esmail has recently commented, the current obliteration of Gaza cannot be adequately grasped within the legal and political framework of genocide, however valuable this term may be in bringing international recognition to the workings and scope of Israel's machinery of death. The continuous and repetitive destruction of Gaza's universities, its hospitals, its mosques and churches, of the fertility of its land and the potability of its water, of its physical physiognomy and memory. Such an orchestrated obliteration aims at something more than physical persons and infrastructure, what Esmail will identify as the historicity of Palestinians. She writes, by centering the colonial mass killing of civilians and the apartheid-based government of the remaining living, these formulations, genocide, apartheid, do not catch up with the repetitive cyclical rhythm of Israel's obliteration machinery. Attention to this rhythm reveals Israel's desire to wish Palestinians out of political and historical existence, to eradicate their historically cultivated way of life, to render them soulless bodies, to obliterate the condition of the Palestinian inhabitation of the land. In short, the desire not to govern Palestinians. Esmail's formulation, quote, a desire to wish Palestinians out of existence, captures a key dimension of the apparatus of disappearance traced above. The very lightness of the act of wishing away, wishing out of existence, an abstraction from the pragmatic space of political and military calculation, much like a train to Switzerland, creates the moral and sensory distance from which an eschatological world-ending violence can be imagined and subsequently enacted by the Israeli military. Fantasizing the Palestinians as a vanishable people from Zionism's onset, Israeli security and military planners have spent decades developing dehumanizing techniques and technologies for the regulation and gradual elimination of the Palestinians under their control. Techniques and technologies that show the same logic of those now deployed against Gaza. One thinks, for example, of the Israeli army's routine practice of bulldozing roads in the West Bank, towns and cities, thereby destroying electrical, water, sewage, and transit infrastructures which the Palestinian residents of these towns and cities must again and again rebuild. This long-standing military tactic can be understood as an act of collective punishment, but it is one that strikes at the soul from a very particular angle. Such infrastructural elements enable and sustain the space of collective relational life, the aspiration and realization of opening a store, a daycare center, of bringing one's harvest of olives to sell, of providing clean water and medical support to injured and aging people, of checking in on one's relatives or friends in a neighboring village, of washing one's hands before prayer at a mosque. That is, it strikes at these acts and the aspiration for a life in common with others that they express, especially the sedimentations of memory and experience that nourish and are strengthened by that life, reducing these sedimentations to the anonymity and perceptual poverty of rubble. It is not only that one is made to feel the futility, hopelessness, and powerlessness of one's predicament as totally subordinated to a brutal military occupation. One is divested of the resources of memory, habit, and knowledge that make a distinct form of life recognizable to those who inherit and extend it, and left instead with the sort of fragmented and fractured human form, outside of time and space, that is the plight of the refugee. A final aspect of Palestinian invisibility that I want to explore here concerns the way the current assault on Gaza by Israel has been framed by Israel and its Western allies as a war against Hamas. From the inception of Israel's current military campaign following upon the attacks by Hamas on October 7th, Israeli and Western leaders and the docile media that serve their interess have insisted that the singular target of Israel's military occupation are what they call Hamas terrorists. Israeli military officials frame every IDF action, the bombings and shellings of hospitals and universities, the shooting of unarmed Palestinians attempting to return to their destroyed homes, the mass arrests in Gaza and the West Bank, as strikes against Hamas terrorists and their, quote, terrorist infrastructures. And the Western press dutifully reiterates as fact the reports that Israel provides them. Thus, we hear of terror tactics and terrorist activity taking place in terror tunnels, that Israeli planes spotted, quote, a suspicious terrorist cell entering Hamas terrorist infrastructure. The pervasive and consistent use of the qualifiers terror and terrorist to identify not only Palestinian fighters, but synecdochally, any activity or object that makes up the life world of Palestinians aims to produce an abstract enemy for whom humanist moral frameworks don't apply. With the target of Israeli violence reified and circumscribed by this terminology, the identifier Palestinian appears as a referent for a population defined by their humanitarian predicament, starving, diseased, displaced, and not as a group suffering from a devastating onslaught by a vastly more powerful military aggressor. Disconnected from the history of resistance to Israeli repression that has shaped their existence, a history for which Hamas forms an integral part, Palestinians are assigned the category of humanitarian subjects, those whose physical and biological vulnerabilities outweigh and thus render invisible any historical identity as subjects of struggle and resistance. Thus, the war against Hamas and the humanitarian rescue of vulnerable, unfortunate humanity are pried apart as two distinct phenomena, sites of distinct effective considerations and investments that further distance and immunize one from the other, hindering any attempt to demonstrate their profound entwinement. President Biden's policy of sending weapons to Israel while at the same time insisting on the provision of humanitarian assistance to the hundreds of thousands of starving Palestinians, and doing so without any sense of contradiction, reflects the efficacy of such a framing. The objectification of Hamas as a discrete identifiable enemy, in no way reducible to the population of Gaza on a whole, would seem to set limits to Israel's campaign of destruction in Gaza. But the reality is actually the opposite. While the war is justified on the international stage through the claim that the enemy, Hamas, is identifiable in terms of a determinate set of people and places, the fact that Hamas, counter to this claim, cannot be circumscribed in this manner, but is complexly linked, historically, politically, socially, administratively, with the broader Palestinian society, means that any attack on Palestinians can be described as an attack on Hamas. The purposeful misidentification of Hamas as a discrete, numerically definable force makes possible and justifies the near infinite extension of the term to any persons or structures Israel deems a threat. In short, Western and Israeli framings of the current assault on Gaza doubly divest the Palestinians of reality. When it turns out that the so-called war on Hamas encompasses the entire obliteration of everything in Gaza, Palestinians have simply disappeared into the rubble-strewn landscape. And when they appear, it is as a humanitarian problem, namely, how to provide shelter and food to starving, homeless people. This is kind of a conclusion. If the West, a concept whose political geography embraces Israel, has been articulated conceptually and effectively on the premise of Palestinian absence, this has not been the case for the countries of the global South, neither historically nor today. If there's one thing that the recent hearings at the International Court of Justice on the legal status of Israel's actions in Palestine made clear, it is that for much of the world, the question of justice for Palestine is not a marginal concern, but rather lies at the intersection of the historical and political fault lines that structure global power today, a point that Ramazan was making in his comments at the beginning. It is in the state of Israel where the humanistic mask of the contemporary American imperial project falls away, where the falsities and contradictions of the post-1948 global institutional order are revealed in their starkest and most violent dimensions. Moreover, Palestinians in this order are not just victims of circumstance, an unfortunate sacrifice necessitated by the West's need for an imperial outpost in the Middle East. The apparatus of oppression developed by Israel to dominate and decimate Palestinian lives, including its immense investments in weapons, have propelled the country to become, in the words of the author Anthony Lowenstein, a global leader in surveillance, drones, and ethno-nationalist fervor. Israel now plays a dominant role at the fascist edge of contemporary capitalism, a country whose spy software, policing techniques, and innovative weapons are increasingly recruited around the world to anticipate and quell thoughts to the ever more unequal distributions of wealth and power. As a recent essay on Israel puts the matter, the fascist fix seeded by the osmosis between settler colonial violence and national security neoliberalism, a fix that Israel models and sells, takes place with relation to global scenarios of crisis and mass unrest, or organized resistance that differ starkly from those of the 1930s. This is what Gustavo Petro's vision of Gaza as, quote, the first experiment to deem all of us disposable is responding to, a form of potentially planetary fascism exacerbated by climate collapse, the vast inequalities produced by racial capitalism, and the ongoing histories of colonial domination. It is an awareness of Israel's position within this emerging order and of the longer colonial history of which it is a part that led so many of the countries that offered testimony at the International Court of Justice hearings to see the predicament of the Palestinian people as also their own. The ongoing and so far ineffectual attempt to use the instruments of international law to restrain Israel from its genocidal campaign has made it ever more clear to many that the structures of power that produce the disposability of the Palestinians are inseparable from those that sustain the ongoing subjugation of the peoples of the global South. Far from absent, Palestine has become hypervisible for those countries, making strikingly evident the lie that the racial logics that undergirded Western rule at the height of European colonialism ended with the formation of the post-World War II international order. Palestine now appears to many as the beachhead in the struggle for decolonization, just as the courage, perseverance, and humanity of the Palestinians over the many years of Israeli rule now stands as a model of resistance to the false promises of that international order. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions. Is that right, or is that not a thing here? No? Okay, sure. Okay, I'm going to grab a pen, all right?
Of course. Thank you, Professor Hirschkind, for his opening keynote speech. It was very insightful. Professor Dr. Charles Hirschkind'e yapmış olduğunu açılış konuşmasından dolayı teşekkür ediyoruz. Right now, what we'll do is we'll have a short Q&A session with Professor Hirschkind. So anyone who wishes to ask their questions, we have about 15-20 minutes. So the stage is yours.
Please. You're fine.
Thank you for this piercing observation. I just wanted you to shed some more light. It was not entirely clear to me how the idea of negation of coequivalence operates in your exposition.
The negation of
Coequivalence.
coevalence, yes.
Because I mean, the way I understand it, it is, I mean, in case of Fabian, it is like European or white anthropologists going all the way to non-Western world, sharing the time, and on return, in their report or ethnography, whatever the time that is shared with the so-called natives, that disappears in the account, right? Now, that idea of negation of coequivalence, how does it operate in the case of Palestinians? It was not entirely clear to me, so I would like you to shed some light.
Yes. I mean, I've always been struck by conversations in the United States in which people often sort of express the view that it's tragic what's happened to the Palestinians, but in some sense it's already happened. Like, it's a fait accompli. And there's almost that sort of tense of what's already happened, that seems to me. And it struck me that there's this sense, therefore, of kind of temporal displacement, a kind of anachronism that Palestinians are there, but their fate is determined in some way. And it's determined because they're part of a history whose outcome has already been decided in that sense. And, you know, it's decided, one could say, when people invoke specifics, they could say, well, you know, the Jews needed to have a place and it had to be there and this is tragic. But there's this sense that the fact that Palestinians are there, and that indeed, you know, the fact that they are there, of course, is well known, and yet there's a sense that at the same time they are a kind of remnant, and remnant from a previous time, because their time is already past. So it's not exactly, Fabian highlights this distinction between the ethnographic situation in which the anthropologist encounters in the present his or her interlocutors, but then goes back and writes and introduces a kind of narrative in which the natives are assigned to a different temporal space. I'm not really focusing so much on that dimension of his work, but more this sort of sense that of inhabiting a different time than the present, a previous time. And that's, so you're right, it's not exactly the same mechanism, yet it has something to do, of course, with the same kind of colonial sense of that one finds in ideas of backwardness and primitivity and the sort of temporal aspect of those terms, which suggests something that's really contemporary but not part of the unfolding world and not part of the future.
In 1946, Gandhi made a claim that Jews have a prior claim over Palestine. The word prior, okay, and in the Zionist reading, of course, it is that we have been there since time immemorial.
Yes.
Right? So once you make that claim, there is no coevalence. Or if you came, it is much, much later. So from that framework, the idea of the negation of coevalence, it looked a little bit odd to me in the otherwise beautiful narrative that you were making.
Yes, that's interesting. But of course, it's interesting that though that claim that, you know, the Jews have been there since time immemorial, it goes hand in hand with the sense then that Jews are part of the unfolding future in a way that Palestinians are not, right? That Jews in some sense are contributing and are, you know, for the very narrative of making the desert bloom to its making the global military machinery bloom, which is what they do today. There's a sense that they are essential to a global future in the way that Palestinians are not. So it's the fact that long-rootedness does not contradict the sense that they're also part of the future in ways that Palestinians cannot claim, at least within these sort of popular narratives.
Thank you very much for the speech. Actually, I will be following Irfan's question because it was also in my mind, especially in the discursive part that you are mentioning, based on the speeches and based on the concepts that created within Western and US-based kind of media, etc. But we anthropologists have this tendency to make this colonial relationship and can see the discursive concepts very easily, but I think there's something newly constructed here because most of the speeches and most of the produced language is recalling the memory, but it is not reflecting in the society or in certain kind of discursive circles as it is. We are thinking about the colonial narrative normally with the barbaric or with the archaic idea or recalling a Muslim woman to be, I don't know, civilized, etc. These are not reflecting as it is. We are having in the post-colonial theory actually nowadays when we are having the Palestinian case. This is my sense. That's why what you are thinking about this discursive construction in terms of reflection level. We are seeing the universities in US now, we are seeing social media is creating another knowledge and epistemological outline. It was not never there in an activist and in a kind of reactionary way. There are still the colonial discursive construction, but new discourses as well. How we can just, I don't know, analyze this. This is a kind of self-questioning and a question as well. Thank you.
Right. How can we understand the sort of the burgeoning support one sees around the world, right, for people who do not think along the lines that this sort of colonial lines that I've outlined here? Yes, this is very striking today to see each day what is happening. And so I think that, on one hand, one hears the reiteration of this kind of logic within the sort of political classes, even in the university administrators, one still hears it. And yet, for a lot of people, it's no longer convincing. And they have come to see something, and Palestinians have a kind of, the realities that they face at the hands of Israel are becoming more and more apparent to people. And certainly this conflict has been immensely important in creating that knowledge. And it's also like, if I think in the universities, people are studying and learning, like there's an intense moment of consciousness raising around this issue that's been taking place. And it's also articulated with other recent struggles around, I think it follows the sort of Black Lives Matter, at least in the United States, and I'm thinking there where I'm most familiar, right? And so there's a kind of politicization that's taken place among students in the last years that perhaps has made them a little bit more open and willing to investigate and not just simply take the received wisdom on these things. And I think that's been a powerful force in creating conditions for what we're seeing. Not just in the United States, though, but I think this is, as I say, I think once you move outside the United States, of course, this is not, this kind of discourse carried much less, of course, weight. And one thinks of the testimonies to the International Court of Justice, how clear it was for many of the different countries that, the sort of, the longer history of violence, that their own countries were very much part of that shared world. So, no, this is one has hope right now to some extent.
Just a quick note, and then I will hand it to
Yeah.
Charles, is it possible to think that maybe this is one of the early moments in history that this colonial language and discourses are not being effective in the public spaces? So when we look at European societies, like the Irish case, for instance, the Irish people case is very interesting. The whole is soccer fans and like peoples in thousands, hundreds of thousands from the streets of Europe. The London demonstrations have been unbelievably huge. So is it possible that this is a kind of breaking point in that historical trajectory, that rather than the consent is coming from the public of the nation states, it is more elites and ruling class who is giving consent to the genocide in Gaza? So the same case maybe, like if you have some surveys in Europe or in North America or elsewhere, the general public voice is, denouncing and, the genocide. And this trouble of the governments or even social media and other outlets to convince people that these people are backward and barbaric and this and that. So the colonial narrative, maybe this first time, is not operating as they wish.
Yes. No, I think it's quite striking. I mean, you can see that the political class has been trying again and again to sort of insist that the lens to see this through is the, that the United States must be on the side of the beleaguered, Israelis and so on. And they have been failing to convince, since very early in the conflict. More and more people have been skeptical of that. And so I do think this is a turning point. I mean, many people have noted there have not been a kind of protest movement since the Vietnam era, at least in the United States, like this. And then you see the crackdown that's taking place against students, and you realize you're kind of at a crisis point where, on one hand, the White House continues to spout the same kind of pro-Israeli line, and the universities feel compelled to kind of try to enforce that line, and people are listening less and less, it seems to me, and there's a stronger awareness. I think in the last few days it's going to have considerable, I'm just every day looking at what's coming across the email, but there's a very strong reactions now. I know in the UC system where I am in California, there's now circulating a very massive kind of faculty effort to denounce what happened at UCLA in terms of the attack on students there. And my hope is that this will be channeled into pushing around divestment, which is what the students have been pushing for from the start. So that's going to be the key question. I mean, my experience in my own department was people were nervous and so on. Like, it was not a clear, people were very unclear, and it was very hard to get people to move initially politically. Now I notice they're starting to sign on to these things that are circulating. But initially, Berkeley has this sort of radical tradition on one hand, and yet so many of the faculty here were kind of very hesitant to take quite the contrary to they were in the Black Lives Matter moment of 2020. Here they were very hesitant, like, well, invoking kind of both sides kind of arguments and all of this. But the students were pretty clear from the start. And they are pulling the faculty. And now with the response that's happening, I think the faculty are being pulled very strongly. So it is a kind of changing moment, absolutely. One really hopes that it will. I was just reading that, the first one university just promised to divest, and a couple others, no, one just, was it Georgetown? No, promised to have a vote in November on divestment. And so if that's a trend, that would be huge. So, please.
Okay, so thank you. I would like just to answer to the question of what's happening, why all of this is happening now, why the students are getting mobilized. I think we can call this the dialectics of history. We are reaching a point where the logic of power has reached a level where it has become, it's trying to monopolize discourse, to monopolize people's perception, but the obliteration machinery that you mentioned, this apparatus of disappearance, is no longer working for many reasons. First of all, of course, these students are educated, but also because this genocide has been happening in real time and aired through, cell phones by the Palestinians themselves. I think the first people who have risen the voice and helped the narrative to be shifted are the Palestinians themselves.
Yes.
Nobody has done this, it's the Palestinians. So actually it has become suddenly impossible, and it was too late, that the Israeli lobby has tried to kind of like have its way, and it was too late. So it was a matter of time. The Palestinians, because there was a resistance movement for a long time, and because also they've taken the forefront of history by taking action, at the same time, narrative follows. So I think what is happening is that many people who see in this resistance movement a symbol for this, David and Goliath, struggle, are seeing themselves in the position of the Palestinians. And suddenly, many representatives, I listened to some of the speeches of representatives of the Black Lives Matter movement who are saying, we are all Hamas now. What does this mean? It's kind of like striking, but at the same time, it means we're all part of this resistance. So Palestine, as you have mentioned, is becoming the symbol of the failure of the global system of upholding any type of justice. And it's also showing the ends of trends within the system to find solutions from within the system itself. So failing actually to protect the weak, to protect the rights of a population, at the same time, while people are seeing that these people are all defending their own existence, is actually, this is what is creating this influx moment. And this is why it's, at many points, it's historical. Now, would this lead to a real change in the system? I think it does not matter, because exactly like 1968, when students mobilized against the war in Vietnam, the war went on. But at the same time, it changed culture, it changed politics forever. It actually created the influx from modernity to post-modernity, the new trends in the Western culture, the critique, etc. So we are seeing exactly the same moment where, regardless of the outcome of these resistance movements within students, etc., they will change, things. Also, regarding this distinction between elites and masses, I want to highlight the fact that there has been a disconnect between governments everywhere and citizenry all through the Western liberal democratic world. So democracy is in crisis, representative systems are in crisis, and in the lack of accountability to the citizens, etc. This is creating also all the solidarity with Israel. Suddenly, Palestine is leading the way in this accountability request from citizens everywhere. And this is why it is a very sad moment, but also it is a hopeful moment, where the pendulum is actually kind of like returning, and where populations are, so the different types of social movements that have been expressing themselves throughout the past 15, 20 years are kind of like coming together. But also this is challenging many old dichotomies that we had, the dichotomies that were, kind of like imposed on us to prevent us from seeing this basic logic of requesting justice for, human rights, etc. This is actually disappearing, the distinctions between East and West, between South and North. Now, what is called the sector of the elites, the universities, Columbia, etc., these are not part of the underworld. These are the center of the elite worldwide. This is actually very symbolic and very significant from this point of view. It means that we, not we, but those who are in power should brace themselves for great changes in the coming and near future, at least in terms of culture and the possibility of, monopolizing discourses and narratives about what's happening in the world.
Yeah, I liked everything you said, and you're right. This is not something that is being led by students it's certainly been led by the Palestinians and paid for with Palestinian lives. I like your optimism and so on. There's another part of me who gets very, feels that worries about the outcome. One also thinks about like the mass demonstrations prior to in 2003 against the war in Iraq and so on, that were around the world, that were huge mobilizations and that had no effect in the end. And so things can just be shoved through, you know, and which is still going on. Like one expects it's being, the Israelis are preparing to go into Rafah, and it doesn't seem like anything will stop it. And so that sense of, there's a sense also a kind of powerless in this moment when there's also considerable sort of sense of power at the same time. So I share your hope in that way, and I think it's a very immensely important and interesting moment, and a crucial one. And one doesn't know what the outcome will be. But thank you for all of that. I thought that was very well said. So please.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask, just you talked about historical necessity in your speech.
Yes.
And how actually this scholar established the parallelism between Native Americans and let's say just Palestinians.
Yes.
As a historical necessity. But at the end of the day, when we look at actually Palestinians, just actually Israelis, some of them just are the actual victims of another historical necessity, Holocaust. Actually, but when we look at these victims, mostly they stand with actually those oppressed most of the time. For example, Native Americans mostly stand with Palestinians and many other oppressed. For example, Irish people as well.
Yes.
But why, how actually some Jewish communities, some part of them, many of them just migrated to Israel and led to Nakba and actually get involved in this situation when they have experienced these catastrophes. How can you explain this, you know, just as an anthropologist?
I wouldn't dare. You know, that's part of a complicated history that I'm not going to try to answer. You know, that comes out of the origins of Zionism in the 19th century, and certainly the way, you know, the Holocaust has become, you know, in the United States, the notion of the term Holocaust was not used until the late 60s, and it was the idea of the mass slaughter of Jews in Germany was not seen until then to be a kind of historical exception the way it later became. And that was very much tied to the post-1967 war and the new status that Israel had in the United States, in which then the Holocaust industry took off in a very serious way. And that really, so the Holocaust, like in American education system, it's like the first thing you must learn and the most important fact you will ever learn. And so that's been so integrated into the education system that it's really undergirded this long history of support for Israel and this kind of blind support for it. So that certainly contributed to the fact that you're talking about, though they also relate to this longer history of Zionism and the late 19th century, both the development of Zionism and the view of Europeans, of Jews, that many of which were quite positively embraced Zionism because they saw it as a way to get rid of kick out the Jews in different parts of Europe and so on. So. But I don't have an anthropological answer. It's mostly a political one. And thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just had a small question about this concept of the global south and this optimism about this movement.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
Because when I see the global south, it's also Brazil, India, China.
Yeah.
And I don't see that sort of pro-Palestinian sentiment among these people.
Yeah.
And these states. For example, my country, India, is the largest importer of arms from Israel. And it has a large support for Zionist ideology on social media. for
Yeah.
whatever reason.
Yes.
So I don't see that this technological movement of social media is somehow breaking that narrative in the global south. Like there is some nuance there. It's not a dialectical moment that this hegemony has been broken.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Brazil. Of course, Brazil has been more publicly, at least the leaders of Brazil have been sometimes quite supportive of Palestine, the current leader. India is another case, and I take it you're from India. And so yes, there's not just sort of a singular block in that sense. There are also fractures within it, and the place of Russia and China and their undoubtedly which play a very important role, and yet they're not strongly supporting Palestine in this conflict. But they are certainly not vocally supporting Israel either, and for obvious reasons, given their relation to the United States. No, I think you're right. It cannot be thought of purely into north-south. But there is a kind of law, many parts of the world that see themselves as part of a history, and they can see today Palestine appears relevant to their own history in particular ways, is illuminated in a way that where they can see the history of Palestine as it's unfolding in this moment as relevant to their own experience since the 19th century forward. And that, for those countries at least, there's a kind of sense of a natural affinity.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Charles.
Hi.
My name is Fatima. I'm from South Africa.
Hi, Fatima.
I noticed UC Berkeley, and my daughter's out at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, so I feel a connection to you in terms of space. Place. I have a question just building off the previous question. And I'm wondering how Islamophobia has really, the role Islamophobia has really played in this narrative, because as a previous speaker was talking about the global south as a South African, I've been thinking increasingly about the heat that, for example, Naleli Pandor, as a Muslim, has taken, globally and locally, for her articulation and support for Palestine. And I'm thinking about that as an example of just one illustration of just a broader Islamophobic moment that we're experiencing beyond just thinking through this in light of genocide, pick a side, anti-apartheid kind of struggle. So I look forward to your comments on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, one thinks about how Islamophobia and its place in the kind of transformation of political life, both in Europe and the United States and well beyond, of course, in India and so on. And so, the United States, I'll just speak from there, it seems to me that, in the last, particularly since 9/11, so on, there's a way in which many of the positions high up in government are filled by professional Islamophobes. And there's a whole sort of, many of the leading advisors, including in the Obama regime and so on, are really intense Islamophobes and have sort of made their political teeth in that world. And I think that has been extremely significant in the kind of blank support for Israel that one finds, both in, of course, that also is being challenged right now in this moment. It seems like this moment, this protest movement that one sees is also, I think, questioning the way that Islamophobia has been sort of, this key, this important sort of dimension of political life in Europe and the United States for a while. And there's a younger generation, I think, that finds that much less convincing. Definitely at Berkeley, I think that one sees the kind of alliances between Muslim student groups, pro-Palestinian groups, Jewish Voice for Peace, and other groups that I think there's not really that Islamophobic narrative doesn't have the sort of purchase it did in a certain moment. It's interesting. I was recently reading like that manifesto of that Norwegian fellow Breivik who killed all of the children of the politicians back in a decade ago or something. What's interesting about him, his description of Israel is very much the description of the kind of a standard Western description. He sees it as this sort of bastion of good in this sort of sea of barbarity. And the way in which he identifies it as is that used in the same terms that Israel identifies itself for its kind of toughness and its ability to stand up. And so there's a way in which the kind of ethno-nationalist, hyper right-wing and often anti-Semitic kind of discourse of people like that is also very close in its, and Islamophobia is what really joins it, because he was an Islamophobe more than anything, really joins it to this much broader political spectrum that's been very powerful for many years. So there's this sort of fanatical right fringe, but that's also on that one issue connects it. The other interesting connection right now that I find is that, the way that the charge of anti-Semitism is being thrown around in the West so virulently. And because both in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans sort of adopt this. I think the House just voted to support a definition of anti-Semitism that equates criticism of Israel basically to anti-Semitism. And Democrats support it largely as much as Republicans. One thing is that the people who are being thrown under the bus in this, the people who are such as like the president of Harvard, are largely black and brown people who tend to be more on a whole supportive of or recognize, the Palestinian cause. So most of the liabilities of this kind of anti-Semitism fervor are going to be the leaders of what had been the kind of, diversity and inclusion movement of the post-George Floyd. So in this sense, it's allowing this kind of alignment between parties, at least in the United States, at the cost of what had been the sort of racial politics of the Democrats. So they're willing to throw that racial politics under the bus in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. And it seems a very, dangerous moment in that sense, but one that reveals, the Democrats where their loyalties are strongest. Hi.
Thank you so much for the speech. And I will also follow Mehmet's question about the genocide.
Yes.
And also the Holocaust, and also the discourse of Holocaust.
Yes.
When you were talking about the unsaying of Palestinians, you were mentioning that the Israeli, let's say the Israeli politicians or the academics using this genocide as a war against Hamas. So we also see that the Hamas has been blamed for many, let's say, unparalleled issues. For example, when they bombed the schools, they mentioned that Hamas were there. And also I think 2 days ago, the Israeli politician in the United Nations says that we know that the Hamas was in the schools, but we didn't know that it was also in the American schools. He was mentioning the Colombian students on their protest. So I'm going to ask you about the Israelis saying. You mentioned the Palestinian unsaying, but there is also the parallel, the Israeli saying in their discourse. As far as I remember, in November, Yuval Harari, the Israeli historian, made parallels between the 7th October and the Battle of Sinai, and the Second Lebanon War, and also the 6 Days War. So while we were talking about how the next generation the politically conscious generation will speak about Palestine, but also how would you consider that the next generation of the Jewish people or the Israeli people will also write their history and will also recollecting data, will also remember their chosen traumas, and their response will be written their own history again. So in the maybe next 50 years, maybe less than 50 years, there will be a huge, let's say, conflict between writing today's history. So the new digital history or the oral history people will speak. So how would you think that their chosen trauma will be in the next 50 years?
Just to be sure I understand, you're asking how will the sort of history of October 7th and its aftermath be written, given that there's a certain Israeli-supported project to write that history as in a particular way to serve Israeli ideological national interests, so on, right? And how will it be written as well as in the United States, and by how will it be studied and so on? Yeah, I mean, again, that's something we will have to see. Certainly, you're right. There's a major project. There are already museums that have opened up in New York or something that are museums of October 7th that display and that make no mention of what's happened in Palestine, but simply show, articles of clothing and photographs from October 7th. So there's a whole education campaign that's being developed and certainly pushed by Zionist lobby and their supporters so you're right. I think this will go forward, and there'll be a lot of perhaps debates in schools about how to teach this and conflict. In Berkeley, where I live right now, in the high school, there's a big conflict over teaching anything about Palestine at all. So there's been a movement to they had something called the Liberated Ethnic Studies program there, in which a focus on Palestine was part of it. And then a group of parents were able to sort of raise that and challenge it and say, no, it should not be addressed that way because that is anti-Semitic. And you can imagine that those same kind of parent movements will be saying, you have to teach October 7th for its truth and the truth of about the people who could have done this to innocent Israelis. So, then I think about, thinking from the United States, if you think about how in schools there are all the debates about what books can be taught, like particularly in southern states, there's been a vast movement of parents to reshape education at the elementary level by intervening and forcing school districts to sort of exclude books that talk about racism, because they think to talk about racism offends and makes their white children feel guilty. So they don't want their children to have to feel guilty. So they want to exclude any discussion of race. Those same parents will probably be the ones who will insist that October 7th be taught in a very particular way that supports an Israeli narrative. And so far, that movement has been very effective in many different states, not in California, but in other states. And I think the same struggle will come out around the issue you're talking about. So I think it'll be an intense struggle for a while. Okay, thanks all of you, and thanks for the very thoughtful questions, and it's been a pleasure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for your patience. That brings us to the end of our opening ceremony. Ramazan Hoja, I think we're going to have to change the times a little bit. What time will the concurrent sessions begin now? in 10 minutes, so 11:45. Okay, so at 11:45, the concurrent sessions are going to begin in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science building. We have them in B04, B07, and B23. Until then, so about 10 minutes, there's coffee and some treats outside for you all. And once again, thank you all again for joining this opening ceremony. Inshallah, the sessions will be very fruitful for everyone. Thank you very much.